Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world, with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
As the economic and political crisis in Western Europe continues to drag millions into poverty and unemployment, ineluctably racism is on the rise, sometimes stoked by parties of the far right, sometimes by respectable politicians, themselves in part responsible for the economic crisis producing the racism. Tony Blair's right-hand man, David Blunkett, spoke recently about a supposed influx of people from Romania and Bulgaria in terms which, if he'd used about black people or Jewish people, would have had him up on a charge. Romanians and Bulgarians, according to Mr. Blunkett, are barely toilet trained and certainly don't know the purpose of a dustbin. So we're asking this week, how racist is Britain? And if you think Britain's racist, have you ever lived in France? Or the Netherlands, Gayatri, where an annual controversy has reached new levels. Tell us about it.
Well, this weekend the Dutch are celebrating their tradition of Saint Nicholas, who is a patron saint of the children and has a crew of black servants, or helpers, as they wish to call it today. If you just look at these pictures, they are an obvious portrayal of racism, but the Dutch uphold this tradition very highly. There's always been protest about this racist element of the tradition, and this year it has even reached the United Nations, to which the Dutch responded furiously. They sent abuse and insult to Professor Shepard, who raised the matter to the Dutch government, and to which the Dutch government
said, this is our business, stay out of it.
And the Prime Minister even responded, well, Black Pete is black, there's not much you can do about that.
Except he's not black, of course, because all over the Netherlands, people are blacking up their faces to look like black servants of Santa Claus. Who'd have thought it in the liberal Netherlands? Shortly, I'll be talking to Lee Jasper, London's most prominent black activist and a senior official in 2 London administrations under Mayor Ken Livingstone. He's produced a devastating new report, Police, Courts and Black Communities, and we'll be asking him about that. But first, Gayatri, you took the Sputnik cameras out in North London asking the public about racism. What was their verdict, guilty or not guilty?
Depending on who you ask, I guess.
Let's take a look.
No, Britain's not a racist country. There are racist individuals, but you can't generalise the whole country as a whole. I lived in an area called Kent for over 12 years, and when I first got there, it was really racist, yeah. A lot of people were racist. But as they got to know me, over the years, it just kind of gradually changed.
This sort of racism is still there as a whole. It's just more hidden out, so it's not as blatant in your face. But I do believe it obviously is still out there.
There's so many cultures in Britain that they all clash, and when they clash, it causes racism.
One of my cousins is black, and basically he sometimes gets stopped for no reason, and I think police are like, they're racist sometimes because they'll stop more black people than white people.
It's everywhere in the world, so they have to try every place to stop racism, yeah. It's all over the world.
I think within every country you have certain racist people, but I don't think as a country it is racist.
Because if you see a lot now around schools and colleges, a lot of black people and white people do mix.
I'm delighted to welcome Lee Jasper aboard the Sputnik. Lee, of course, from up here, the colour of people's skin is quite invisible, but from your devastating new report down on the street, it looks very different. Tell us about it.
Well, what's happened is that in the last month we produced 2 reports, one by government which analyses the incidence of race and racism within the criminal justice system, another by a charity focusing on drugs, that looks at the stop and search within the metropolitan in London area and the extent to which black and white people get differentially charged with crimes, even though they may be first-time offenders, the both of them. And the conclusions of these reports are that in relation to the criminal justice system, if you're black, you're 20% more likely to be sent to jail for a like-on-like offence with a white offender, and you, on average, will receive 24 months as opposed to the white offender who will receive 15 months. And that's even in the backdrop against white offenders having a more extensive criminal record and black people committing less crime. They are still more likely to be sent to jail. And then, of course, the report by the Release charity, the drugs charity, found out that if you are a first-time offender, black and white, and we get caught with cannabis, I will be 50% more likely to be sent to court than you will. And if we were to be caught with cocaine, I am 70% more likely to be sent to court than you will. And what we've, a startling figure, is that the dragnet for sucking our people into the criminal justice system is the power of the police and stop and search. And they have conducted over 1.5 million stop and search on Africans, Caribbean, Asian, people of mixed heritage, Asian and white, black and white, here in the capital. An absolutely staggering number.
This is just in 5 years.
Since 2008.
2008,
yes.
1.5 million people in Britain have been stopped and searched by the police.
In London only.
It's a staggering figure.
It is.
Now, of those, what percentage are from the black and minority ethnic population?
840,000 are black, 533,000 are Asian, and the 133,000 are Asian and mixed, mixed heritage. In this multicultural society.
You see, even for me as a practitioner in the field, the statistics, the facts in your report were actually stunning. And you had a triptych which grabbed me. You said that racism in the police and justice system in Britain was resurgent, out of control, and rampant. I mean, these are strong terms.
It is, and if you look at the figures for stop and search since 2008, increased by 7%. If you look at the number of black young people in prison establishments, that's increased since 2008 by 100%. So you get the sense of a current coalition government having been given a green light to the police to act as discriminatory and the courts to act as discriminatory and like, and it's tantamount to a virtual war of oppression on black people.
Well, this war is another of the words in your report that jumped out and hit me. I mean, this is a war that is currently under the surface. I'm sure that the great majority of British people have absolutely no idea about these kind of facts, but if they erupt, if this war erupts in the kind of riots that we have seen in Britain before, suddenly all the cameras will be there.
I think it's Dr. Martin Luther King who said riots are the voices of the unheard. I think very much what you're looking at is a ramping up of racism by this coalition government that has unleashed resurgent levels of institutionalised racism in policing and criminal justice. And the media are studiously ignoring the real story, which is this mass criminalisation on a scale that people will not believe in relation to both African, Caribbean and Asian communities.
Now, the institutionalisation is in a way the most serious.
Yeah.
An individual police officer can be a racist, an individual jailer can be a racist, but if the institutions are pervaded with this poison, then we're really in big trouble. And I was struck in your report by the sentences being handed out by judges. One expects, even I expect, judges at least to have better judgment than that, but your figures seem to suggest that they willy-nilly hand out condign punishment to black people and lenient punishment to white people.
You know, Britain is supposed to be a country that is based upon the principles of fairness, equality and justice. And you expect, don't you, that a court would be a haven for such principles, where they would be fairly applied and judiciously executed. And what the government's own report, so we're relying on government figures here, which I think are an underestimate, but the government's own report demonstrates, but that in Crown Court and Magistrates Court, it's routinely the case that black offenders are given sentences way in excess of those given for white offenders with more complex criminal records, more extensive criminal activity, who do not end up in jail, whereas the black defenders do.
And the drugs question, again, in your... I mean, I hate drugs, don't get me wrong, but the idea that black people are the bigger drug takers is slaughtered in your report.
Absolutely.
Actually, white people take more drugs than black people do, but black people are more likely to be sent to court if found with drugs, and in court, much more likely to get a very harsh sentence.
I think these are the real critical anomalies in relation to where we are. On the one hand, black people use less drugs than the white communities, and yet the focus of policing operations is around stopping black use. And when they are stopped and charged, as we rightly said, they are more likely to be sent to court, more likely. It's as if you and I stole a loaf of bread, and that's the first crime we've ever committed. You will get a caution, I will get sent to court. That's the simplest way of explaining it to the majority of people. And you're absolutely right, it's an outrageous calumny that it's remaining not on the news agenda, not on the political agenda, and we're going to have to work hard to push that up, including you, George, in the House of Parliament, who are going to have to start to press the Ministry of Justice on some well-aimed questions that I'm happy to provide.
The Ministry of Justice being an Orwellian term. Just lastly, is it the economy stupid, as Clinton once said? Is it because the economy is crashing, because there is real penury amongst the mass of the people, that there's a conscious or unconscious effort to exploit racism as a response to that crisis?
Well, certainly this coalition government is hell-bent on scapegoating communities, whether they're Muslim communities, whether they're black communities, and now we've had the addition of Roma and Romanian communities into that. I saw tales of Romas being accused of stealing babies and all sorts of other hysterical outbursts. The reason for that, in my view, is that they're seeking to distract the populace from the architects of the real and those really guilty for exploiting the British economy, and those are the casino bankers and the top 1%. But in relation to cuts, it's an important question, because cuts to police officers' numbers leads them to face increased pressure from politicians to meet crime targets, and when they get into that situation, they have a policing called noble cause corruption, where they think, well, you're not guilty of this, but you look slightly guilty anyway, so I'm going to send you through the criminal justice system. And that's what's happening routinely. And as officer numbers are cut and the pressure on politicians to meet crime targets goes up, then so will disproportionate, bad, unprofessional, racist policing increase, because the police are well aware of the fact that if I put a black boy in front of a judge, he will convict him and send him to jail. And therefore they meet their crime and arrest targets by a process of fishing in a salmon pool that is made up entirely of African, Caribbean and Asian people.
And fill privatised prisons for the profit
of those
that run them.
That's a whole other story.
Lee Jasper, thanks for joining us on the Sputnik. After the break, we'll be talking to another big British political figure with strong views on race and policing, former Conservative Minister and MP and Vice Chairman of the Conservative Party, Steve Norris. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Sputnik. Now, race is not the only question mark hanging over the British police. A series of scandals over decades have destroyed the overwhelmingly benign reputation enjoyed by the police when I was young. And Dixon of Dock Green, a polite, avuncular officer to whom you were encouraged to turn if you ever had a problem or even just needed to ask directions. Since the 1970s, these scandals have dogged the constabulary. And whilst their reputation isn't as low as politicians and journalists yet, it's headed that way. Gayatri asked some members of the British public what they thought of the police. What did they think?
Well, I guess that depends on who you ask.
Let's take a look.
And what's going on in the world today, I think they do a very good job and they do what they can for us. I do believe in that.
Yeah, they was doing a good job, but then what happened with Mark Duggan and all of that, I thought that was a bit racist how that all happened. But apart from that, I think they're doing their job.
Most police nowadays, not all police, I know that some of them are pretty racist nowadays, and that's why I wouldn't really put my trust into police.
Yeah, that's true, that's true.
If anything happens, we will rely on the police, so that's what I'm interested in. They're good people.
I think they can make, like, obviously a bit more effort and stuff. I don't think there's enough police at night, and there ought to be more at night than in like the daytime.
I do think police do a good job. I do. Sometimes I do trust them. Sometimes I do think maybe the races, they can be a bit unfair. But at the end of the day, I do think they do a good job.
No, I don't trust them. As a young person, I don't. I think they discriminate against young people, so...
They're doing very, very good job. If there is any accident, they will come in a minute. You know, 5-10 minutes, they will come.
Steve Norris twice ran for London Mayor for the Conservative Party. If he'd won, people would have been surprised at just how challenging his policing policies would have been and how much he hated racism and still does. Steve Norris, welcome to Sputnik. As you've seen, we've been asking Londoners what they think of policing as an institution, and it very much depends who you are, what age you are, and I'm sorry to say, what colour you are. But you once said to me when we were in Parliament together that the police were the last great unreformed British institution. You still hold to that?
I think I actually said it was the last great reformed mafia family, great unreformed mafia family.
Yes,
but, you
yes,
know,
you did. Yeah,
and I'll tell
I was
you what,
trying to exculpate you.
Yeah, very decent of you. But no, I'll tell you exactly why. Because the police have been very, very good at pushing away governments, local governments and central governments, hiding behind this issue of operational responsibility. You know, you can dictate policy, but you can't dictate my operational priorities. Now, if it ever came to a stage where a politician said, arrest him first before her, you know, that would be quite wrong, something that you and I would desperately dislike. No police service should ever be run on those lines. But what this is masking is quite a different issue. You know, when, for example, just ordinary people talk about saying, shouldn't we have more police on the street? Wouldn't it be better if the police actually engaged more directly with the community? Maybe they could build some trust when the community could see that they were, the vast majority of them, perfectly decent people, where police themselves might get a little bit closer to what the issues were among, you know, ethnic minority communities and so on, and with young people. Well, then they'll say, oh, no, you can't tell us that because that's an operational matter. We like our little cars, you know, buzzing down the street, dee-da, dee-da, and playing games. And I've always thought those cups of tea must be getting really chilled in the station for half of those guys, you know. What you see so often is that actually it's the policeman who's parked on the double yellow lines with the doors open getting a couple of hamburgers. You know, it's the policeman who treats you as if you're guilty before you even opened your mouth. It's the policeman who pushes you around with a wave of the hand. I know they've got to be assertive. I know that's part of the job, but they take assertion to levels which are really very unhealthy. I think unless we start cracking that, then the problems that you've been talking about are going to get worse. They really are. And we had police and crime commissioners, you know, it's a kind of, it's a pretty feeble attempt to solve the problem. Very, very feeble. We still haven't got control
the public
back.
Voted with their feet in droves
did
in
they
not voting.
Yeah, well, yeah.
As we saw from Gayatri's Vox Pops, it kind of depends what age you are and what colour you are, but these scandals that have accumulated since the 1970s, there was the miners' strike, there was the Hillsborough disaster, the Stephen Lawrence murder and how that was mishandled, the Mark Duggan seems to still be an issue even today.
That one is obviously the one that's most living on the street. That's the most salient aspect of the police, the racist element of the police. Not so
and that triggered the London riots, of course, 2 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
The slaying of Mark Duggan in Tottenham began riots throughout the length and breadth almost of the country. These scandals, as they accumulate, are chipping away very substantially at the police's credibility.
Yeah, I think they are. And actually, I don't think this is confined to ethnic minorities now. I think what's worse is that, you know, you know, ordinary white, middle-class, you know, suburban citizens are beginning to get the impression that you can't trust the police to the same degree. And that's terrifying. It really is. And not least because, you know, I'm sure the vast majority of them are just, you know, trying to do a difficult job. Nobody ever said being in policing was going to be easy. But there is that sufficient element where we see time and time again that we're being presented with a story which is simply not the truth. I mean, Hillsborough, of course, you know, we now know
The falsification of thousands of statements.
Substantial falsification, not of one person's evidence, but of hundreds and hundreds of statements. You know, that's the kind of evidence that, you know, even normal Guardian reading.
You're a Liverpool man, of course.
I am indeed. I am indeed. It matters a lot to us because we were treated, the people of the city, and you know, people who live there, were treated as if they were de facto guilty because they came from Liverpool. It was probably their fault. What emerged was that the police had actually been fabricating statements, interfering with statements to give an impression which justified their own actions. And you know, I think that's the kind of issue we've got.
Even the chief whip in the Conservative government lost his job in very highly contentious circumstances. We can't go into them all because there are still live proceedings in the courts. But if the chief whip of the government can claim that the police set him up, whether he's right or wrong about that, then what about a young black boy in Brixton?
What about the culture that the police apparently developed of just taking a bung every time they rang a newspaper to tell them about a little tidbit that actually they'd uncovered, you know, in the course of their duty? They were committing a criminal offence, but it was apparently absolutely widespread. And you're seeing that in the dozens of people who are now being pulled in, some of them journalists, some of them police officers.
Some have pled guilty, so we can talk about their case.
So.
We had journalists who were being paid by, or rather police officers and other security officials being paid money by newspapers to give the whereabouts of the Queen and other members of the royal family in exchange for money.
It's intolerable, and I think it just sort of, it underlies this issue that there's one law for you and there's one law for me as a police officer, and that law is canteen culture, look after your mates, do whatever you have to do, say whatever you have to say, you know, and look, if you do have to, if you really are in the headlights, if you're about to be convicted, don't worry, we'll let you retire on full pension, and then say, well, we can't prosecute you, you're no longer a police officer.
Like Life on Mars.
Absolutely. Imagine the only thing I liked about that was the car.
It was a wonderful
it was great.
And a good camel overcoat.
Yeah, absolutely.
You and I could have worn
that.
Yeah,
absolutely.
No, the 1970s gets a bum rap, in my opinion. But unfortunately, you're not the Mayor of London, though twice you nearly did become so. If you were the Mayor of London, and thus in charge of the Metropolitan Police, what would you do about the Metropolitan Police?
I'd take a lot more active interest in what the Commissioner is actually doing about, you know, this issue, because it's huge and it's in danger of becoming endemic, having maybe only started with a few, you know, that idea that there only has to be one bad apple in a barrel and it spreads everywhere. You know, what Boris Johnson did almost by accident was to change the Commissioner. What he actually showed, again, I suspect almost by accident, was that the Mayor of London does have a very substantial real power in terms of the way the Metropolitan Police manages itself. And I would start with the Met. It's by far the biggest force. And it's where, you know, we can stand
more than half the problem in the country is here.
Absolutely. I'm afraid that's true. And therefore, I would literally take much more practical interest in what are you doing, Bernard Hogan, how to sort this out. What sort of actions are you taking to prevent officers being able to walk away into retirement with a cosy pension? What are you doing to set up the kind of rules that means we can cross-check about statements, that we know when people are, you know, making statements that they're doing so authoritatively? What are you even doing about technology, for God's sake?
Why are you still using notebooks and pencils?
Still using notebooks and pencils? There's a thing out there, it's big now, it's called the internet, and apparently you can send quite reliable messages on it that can be duplicated endlessly. You know, I mean, there are some really extraordinary things still happening in the Metropolitan Police, which I really do think need to be rooted out.
Steve Norris, thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much indeed. Pleasure.
Well, this is your part of the show where you tell us what you think through our social media portal, RT_Sputnik. Gayatri, is it fast and furious still on the internet?
It's completely polarizing when I ask them the question about racism, whether Britain is racist. One says yes, the one says no. It's very extreme. Celt Islam says that the UK is better than most European countries, and that's for sure. I, coming from the Netherlands, definitely agree with that.
I agree with that also. I mean, notwithstanding what we've heard on this show, I agree with that. Doesn't mean it's good, it's very bad.
Yeah.
It's just worse elsewhere.
Yeah.
As I always say, if you think England's racist, you've never lived in France.
No, imagine how worse it is in other countries. Yas Khalid answers that Britain today is less racist from the time my parents arrived in Britain, but increasingly Islamophobic, thanks to the fear perpetuated in the media.
Fair point.
Yeah, indeed. Emmy Wyatt says, I think Britain has become more racist in the last 10 years and less tolerant, more blatantly nasty. So a complete opposite.
Yeah, well, as the economy dips further and further, racism ineluctably rises, and politicians have an interest in stoking it because there's votes in it. As with Wilders in the Netherlands, or the Front National in France, or right-wing politicians of various parties here in Britain, they know there's political money in racism.
On policing, Manoli Moriarty replies that there's definitely room for improvement, but the UK police conduct efficient work and have a tolerant approach compared to other European forces. To which Sharona then says, in my experience, no. Many people have lost confidence and that they'll even bother to turn up. So, very contrasting
Diverse, polarized. Again, of course it's on Twitter, I can't tell the age or ethnicity of all of the people writing there. But it's been the story of your research into this, that the younger you are and the blacker you are, and especially the more Islamic you are, the more you've got a problem with the British police.
Yeah, I definitely conclude that from my encounters on the streets.
Well, unfortunately, that's all we've got time for today.
But you know how to reach us at RT_Sputnik. That's it from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.